Yes, Mr. M.
Thank you. Is Mr. K back on the screen?
Yes, I'm here.
Well, hello there. That's lovely. I think we were about to go back to, you were at the scene at Hayfield Road and you've told us about that, and I wanted to move on to ask you about the arrangements you made for moving the officers back to Kirkcaldy Police Office. Do you remember what you were thinking at that time about arrangements to move the officers who'd attended the scene and move them back to Kirkcaldy?
Yeah, I think Colin Robson kind of had the ball rolling, but when I turned up and kind of was made mention from APS Maxwell of the involvement, I knew that I had to remove them from the locus, as I say, then get other resources in to secure the locus for later. We'd have to bring the officers back for their own welfare, well-being, and to protect the inquiry, because I presumed that once the Mattery CID were involved, they would probably be looking for statements and their clothing, etc.
Now, at the moment, Mr. Kay, I think that's quite quiet. Can I just check that I think it might be helpful if it's possible for the magicians to put the sound up slightly. Everything's okay with you?
I could try it on.
Oh, that sounds.
I could try it on mine.
That sounds.
That better?
That's lovely. Thank you. Thank you very much. Sorry, I didn't catch everything you said about the arrangements that you were making. You said that D.I. Robson had things in hand when you arrived, but then you were thinking about. Can you tell us again what
Obviously,
arrangements you made?
I would need to secure other officers from around the division, if not out west, to come and take over. Thereafter, as I said, to protect the integrity of the inquiry and for the officers involved, they would need to come back to the station where I presumed the MIT or the CID would get involved for statements and probably recovery of their clothing, etc.
So, for the officers who were involved at Hayfield Road with the events, what was the plan in your mind as to what would happen with them?
Well, in my mind, we would go back and create a sterile area for cross-contamination and to make it private for them, so there was no conjecture or speculation out west. And obviously, as I say, I was quite firm in my mind this would go critical and the MIT would get involved, and I knew they would like to speak to them separately and probably remove their clothing, and we would need to contact the Federation.
Right. So let me just take you through that. You say you were thinking about a sterile area. What's a sterile area?
Well, obviously, if they're going to take their clothing, we're not wanting them mixing with other officers, or we're not wanting, obviously, the conjecture and the speculation to be rising as well, and also to make sure that obviously nobody was getting panicking or things like that. We could get a bit of privacy with their federation rep and whoever would be dealing with it moving forward.
What, for the members of the public that might be listening to evidence, can you explain to them why is it important that the officers shouldn't be mixing with other officers? The officers who'd been at the scene, why was it important that they not be mixing with others?
Well, if the officers were lying on top of the male and there's any accusations of footprints or DNA or blood or saliva, etc., we don't want that. And if the other officers have been dealing with something in their daily business, you're not wanting that coming together. And also, it was at a time where I didn't think the other officers should be sort of left alone within the station, speaking to others about what happened. I thought it was better to contain them and go through the appropriate people.
Why is it important that the officers don't speak to other people in the station?
Well, already you've said to me that some of my statement differs from others. It's obvious, as I say, you've got conjecture, you've got speculation. It would soon hit the media, it would soon be on social media, and obviously we still, in my mind, had a rough idea of what personally or maybe happened, but I still didn't know the full out of it. It was, as I say, it was going to go critical, and the MIT would now be running the inquiry with Gary McEwen. So I had to get things in place, then let them decide on the next moves, and the Federation would want to come in and get involved and give their appropriate advice.
And Gary McEwen, who, you've mentioned his name, who did you think would be in charge when the officers got back to Kirkcaldy Police Office, in charge of the situation?
Once we went back to there, obviously Colin Robson and myself could speak to them, but definitely the inquiry were removed to the MIT and away from myself, because I was still dealing with daily business.
So who would take over command or control or be in charge of handling the matter once officers were back at Kirkcaldy?
Yeah, once it was back and settled, Gary McEwen would be overseeing the full thing with being the on-call super, maybe even chief super at the time, but then would be a MIT-led inquiry. So he would allow them, in tandem with him, to run it from there.
And when you use the phrase MIT-led, is that the Major Incident Team?
Yeah.
Thank you. And you said the words go critical. Is that a critical incident being declared?
Yeah. As I said before, that's super and above level. That's not for me.
We may have heard that Gary McEwen did subsequently declare a critical incident at 9:10 in the morning. Is that what you mean when you say go critical?
Yeah.
And when that's declared, do certain protocols have to be followed?
Yeah, there's certain protocols that have to be in place for it to be a critical incident in the first place. Yes, when that happens, my role as PIO would be diluted and it would be over to them.
Right. And you've talked about, before you've even left the scene at Hayfield Road, you were thinking about maybe having to remove the clothing of the officers. What was the purpose of that?
Yeah, that's just my experience thinking we've obviously got a death in custody, so, and for the contamination, etc., and any evidence moving forward, that the MIT team would probably want everything to hand.
When did you become aware that Mr. Bio had died?
Couldn't recall the exact moment, but I would imagine the CID has probably passed that to me by the time I got back to the station. I knew it wasn't sort of looking well for Mr. Bio in that circumstance, but I can't recall the exact time.
But you weren't aware of him passing away when you were at Hayfield Road?
No.
And then you've mentioned the SPF. What involvement would they have?
Well, any sort of out of the normal thing at the weekend, we would always contract the Federation. And it was Amanda Gibbon. She was back at the station by the time I was there. She'd be there to offer advice and support. And obviously if you took the clothing, she would supply them with this basic clothes and food and drink, etc.
We've heard from Amanda Gibbon. She was a Police Federation rep.
Yeah.
Thanks. And then you've also talked about speculation and the officers having privacy. Was their well-being something that you considered?
Yeah, I spoke to Amanda about obviously replenishing of clothes and obviously looking after them food and drink wise. She said that she would be doing that through Federation funds. And I'm sure Colin Robson spoke to them as well. Then, as I said, by that time I was still doing other stuff, and when it became a MIT-led inquiry, I just obviously made it aware that I was there for any support or any chat, etc. But it would be MIT-led inquiry now, and as I say, I would be diluted from the actual involvement then.
When did you become aware that it was going to be a MIT-led inquiry? from the major incident team?
Well, if I'm being honest, I knew as soon as I got the information that he had passed that it would go that way.
Right.
But I would ask, obviously, we'd ask the control room to inform the on-call super about what would happen, and I would imagine Colin Robertson would do the same for the CID side of things. So it would have happened quite quick, but I knew, obviously, just as through experience, that it would go that way.
Thank you. So, can you tell us what instructions you gave before the officers left Hayfield Road? You've told us about the things you had in mind. So what instructions did you give out to officers in order to start preparing them for the return to Kirkcaldy Police Office?
I can't recall 100%, but I would have said to Scott Maxwell, and I don't know if it's articulated, probably said over the radio that we'd be removing them and I would bring other officers in to take their place.
We've heard evidence from Sergeant Maxwell in June, and he says that you gave him information and instructions basically to attend back at the police station in the canteen, to regroup, to just get everyone there and make sure everyone is safe and well, and not to obviously discuss in specifics what's going on. Would you agree with that summary?
Yeah, that would be accurate. I would have asked him to remove himself as well, because he was involved, but also he could act as a conduit with being a supervisor and be visible or all back at the station as well.
What instructions, if any, did you give about creating a sterile area in the canteen?
Same again, I couldn't give you 100% articulation, but it would be to keep them there, keep them sterile and not allow anybody else in. We would create a sitting canteen if need be, and as I say, for the reasons I spoke about before, but any cross-contamination and any sort of media aware or conjecture, just basically to keep it tight till the MIT can maintain control.
What contact did you have with any of your senior officers or supervisors in relation to bringing the MIT team, the MIT-led team, into the situation?
I will have spoke to Gary McEwen as he was on call. Then after that, he would have contacted the MIT and ran the show from that side of things. Other seniors I then contacted was through resources for high visibility teams and door-to-door, etc. for the next 2 or 3 days. But out with that, I didn't speak to them regarding the incident as well. Because as I say, I was actually still being PIO for the rest of the division.
Right. When did you first speak to Gary McEwen?
I would imagine within 5-10 minutes back at the station when I went through to see him in the CID part of the building.
So that was after you'd left Hayfield Road?
Yeah, he was never at Locus as far as I can recollect.
Before we move on to events in Kirkcaldy Police Station, can I ask you, we've also heard evidence from PC Kaylee Good, who remembers speaking to you at Hayfield Road, and she says you told her to put on her hat and her yellow jacket, even though she had her high-vis vest on. And it may have been because it was then raining and windy and I was shivering. Do you remember having a conversation with Kaylee Good?
I don't, sorry.
Right. Do you remember what the weather was like that day?
Yeah, I think it was, I don't think it was raining. I think it wasn't the best morning. I think it was quite sort of dull, overcast, maybe rain drawn through, if I could correctly remember.
What temperature was it?
Anything for 7 to 12, 7 to 14 maybe.
Right.
It certainly wasn't freezing, but it wasn't hot either.
Right. Were you wearing a jacket?
Couldn't answer that. I'd probably say no. I probably had my t-shirt or fleece and my high-vis vest on.
Thanks. Moving on to your return to Kirkcaldy Police Office, you've talked about the sterile area. Perhaps we could look at your inquiry statement at paragraph 93. Now you'll have a copy of this in front of you, and what I'll do is I'll read out part of this or all of this paragraph. So this is where it says returned Kirkcaldy Police Station. 93, then I went back to the station to the canteen. Amanda Given from the Federation was there. D.I. Robson was there. We made the canteen sterile and a separate eating area for everybody. 94, I asked them to stay in the canteen. You're not wanting the cross-contamination or transference of anything, so I asked them to stay. Can I ask you about those matters? What was it that you did to make the canteen sterile?
Nothing special. Sterile, just within the framework of nobody in and nobody out, nothing to do with inquiry, apart from elected members of staff from the MIT.
We've heard from some witnesses there were notices put up on the door. Was that something that you did or were involved in?
No, I can't comment on that, to be honest.
So, what steps did you take to make it sterile?
I don't know if that seems more fanciful than it means. It just basically means nobody has to leave because there was facilities there. Then went out, and when Scott was in, we brought another sergeant in and other cops in to facilitate the calls to just say that the canteen was a no-go area and we'd made a secondary canteen elsewhere, and Gary McCune would be aware of that and he would pass it to the MIT, and there would be a select few from the MIT that would go in and have to do what they would do. And Colin Robson would also be involved, conduit for the MIT, and Amanda was there. I think then after that, I actually never went back to the canteen.
How long did you spend in the canteen after you went back to Kirkcaldy Police Office?
Not long, 5-10 minutes, because Colin and Amanda Given were already there, and I think I'd liaised with Jane Coombe, who was another inspector. I asked her to come from the Cow and Beef area to act as a conduit for the inquiry to everybody that was involved, to allow me to go back to the daily business.
Was Jane Coombe in the canteen when you were there?
No.
When you said you made a secondary canteen elsewhere, was that elsewhere in Kirkcaldy Police Office?
Yeah. But as I say, nothing fanciful. It'd just be somewhere where they can go and or a breakaway area if required.
So whose responsibility was it to disseminate information that the canteen was a no-go area?
I would do it. Scott Maxwell could do it. D.I. Robson can do it.
And who actually did
as
it?
a Sunday morning, it wouldn't be difficult to convey that message out.
Who actually did that? Or did you all do it?
I would say, I definitely would have told the incoming cops who were taking over frontline duties, and they would have dealt with the crime side of things.
Was that the replacement officers that you gathered in from other areas?
Yeah, because obviously the full shift was there and there were still calls coming into Kirkcaldy.
We've heard some evidence that people were walking in and out of the canteen. Do you have any comment about that?
I wasn't aware of it, sorry.
And we've heard that, as you say in 94, paragraph 94, I asked them to stay in the canteen. We've heard evidence that 2 officers left the canteen to go and get white paper cups and had conversations with the custody officer at the time. Do you have any comment about that?
Same again, that's news to me. As I say, I've left them in the presence of an inspector, a sergeant, a federation rep, a chief super and a full investigation team. Anything that went on after that, as I say, I'm not aware.
Thank you. You talked about, before you left Hayfield Road, you were thinking about recovering equipment from the officers. Do you know what arrangements, if any, were made about recovering equipment from the officers? Were you involved with that in any way?
No, as I say, that would be over the meeting.
So you had no involvement in that decision or when that was done?
No.
Thank you. Can I look at paragraph 95? You say, I remember having a chat with the officers. Myself and D.I. Robson spoke to the officers to say that they were probably going to have to give up their clothing and their boots for evidence. And this didn't mean to say that they were victims or guilty. It was just protocol, transparency. And that would be the way forward. We made sure their well-being was fine. And you say you had that conversation with the officers. Can we move down, please, on the screen, if that's possible? And then it says they were probably thinking, am I getting sacked? Have I done anything wrong? Have I done anything right? I've got young cops saying to me, why are you taking my stuff? I was just saying to them that we've got a death in custody and yous have come into contact. Common sense says we're going to take your clothing. It's just protocol. It's the proper thing to do for transparency. I was saying they were not under suspicion for any offences, bearing in mind I've got probationers there who had maybe been in the job 6 weeks. And can I ask you, what was the importance, as far as you were concerned, of the fact that some of them were probationers?
Well, when I went into the canteen, if I can recall, I think Colin had already been speaking, so I'm of the mind and of a personal nature, I wasn't going to speak for the sake of it, just to hear my own voice. So I spoke, which I thought was relevant, and making them aware. As I say, we had some cops who'd been in the jobs 6 weeks, maybe less than that. I think McDonough, I think Good was 3-4 months. So any contact they've had with the public, they've been taking their clothes. They've been, obviously, because we think, or we've got evidence to think they've done something wrong. So all of a sudden, in layman's terms, the tables are turned on them. I was just reassuring them to be transparent and be professional and to do the right thing. It would be good for us to take everybody's clothing and keep it sort of fluid that way. And that, as I said, at that time, it's not to say they've done anything wrong, it's not to say they've done anything right, but just everybody together would be uniform and we would take everything away.
And do you know who would determine the status of the officers? You talk in paragraph 95, it didn't mean they were victims, it didn't mean they were guilty. Who was it that would determine what the status of the officers would be?
That's out with my control. As I say, I'm trying to answer these the best I can, and some to you might appear vague, but with the PIO role, it'd actually be a good thing. If we're a fatality for road policing, or if it's anything serious, anything that revolves proper serious, once we do the basics and secure it, the specialised units come in, then we go away and go into the next job, if you like. So anything along these lines, or when I've left the canteen, that was probably me only getting involved through the odd welfare check or Gary McEwen tasking me for something. Because as I say, I still had the rest of the division to run, and it was now getting a MIT-led inquiry. So there was actually no requirement for me to be there.
Thank you. Can I ask you about forms? We've heard some evidence about forms and when they should be completed. We heard evidence yesterday that use of spray forms should have been completed and sent to the PERC within 24 hours. And if the officer's not available, a sergeant can send those forms. Did you give any instructions or commands in relation to the completion of use of spray forms?
Can't recall, but any sergeant of mine and Scott Maxwell would know I like them in for the end of that shift, if possible. And if not, generally document a good reason why. With this inquiry, I don't know, with the MIT becoming involved, it's maybe got clouded the waters or there's been a delay. I couldn't answer that, but best practice, end of the shift before we all go home.
And what about use of force forms? What's
Same
best?
answer.
What's your practice in relation to them?
Same again, end of the shift.
What about the completion of notebooks for officers who have used force during a shift?
That's a personal preference, but I would expect the sergeants to be getting them to document it, if not at the time, as soon as reasonably possible. Same again, best practice.
Did you have any discussions about the completion of paperwork or issue any instructions before you went on to get on with your other work?
I can't recall, but I'd also be astonished if I hadn't said to Scott to make sure that that was in as per normal.
And that's Scott Maxwell.
Yeah.
And what is your view on completion of operational statements? You've told us about your own operational statement, which you completed within 1 week of the events. What would your expectation have been in relation to the officers who were involved?
Well, that depends. It's a personal preference. I like to do mine, A, keep it fresh, and B, I knew it was coming through my experience. At that time, I had 7 or 8 police complaints. So I generally send an email out to the officer and the sergeant with a rough description of what the complaint is and ask them to give me my operational statement generally within a week of me getting it, because I've got a timeline. But as I say, that's a personal preference, and especially these young officers, they wouldn't be aware that we probably have to do it. And because of the day, maybe slips some of their mind, but also they don't have to do it, I suppose, till they get it requested.
Right. And who would be the person that would be making a request in your experience? Would it only be if there was a complaint?
If you put a complaint in and it comes to PSD, we've got a central collection point at B Division who would then, if it was my area, send it out to me, or if it was coming in through the channels, send it to different inspectors for fairness. Then if it was mine, I would thereafter request it. But if it was the PIC or the MIT or PSD, that would be their gift to decide when they started requesting these statements in.
And can I just be clear, PSD is that the Professional Standards Department in Police Scotland?
Yeah.
Can I ask you about threats at the time? You were asked about this and gave some comment in your operational statement. So if we look at paragraph 121 of your inquiry statement, you will see that you were asked, under reference to your perk statement at page 2, I also cannot recall any briefing being given regarding a threat to a female officer. We've heard some evidence about this at an earlier hearing.
Yeah.
In your role...
Sorry.
No, sorry, I was going to ask, in your role at the time of these events, in May 2015, would you have been aware of briefings given to officers about threats and threat levels?
If the sergeants were doing it locally, if I wasn't in attendance to these briefings, I would definitely be aware, because that was recorded on your daily log, I would think, or there would be some form of correspondence I would have seen, unless it was previous and I was on holiday or not aware, etc. But certainly wasn't any briefing that I can recall within the Kirkcaldy Police Station.
Thank you. We've heard some evidence from a former constable, Alan Payton, in June regarding his recollection. And let me just summarise what it was that he said. There was a strong rumour going about in Kirkcaldy Police Station that a female officer was going to get injured by a lone wolf. And he was aware that Nicole Short was going to Hayfield Road on the 3rd of May. He raised it, being a senior sort of member on the team, I raised it with Inspector Stephen Kay at muster, asking if he could get in touch with Intelligence Department and also perhaps Special Branch to find out if there was anything in it, and nothing came back. I raised it only days before this, that is the 3rd of May. So this was a Sunday, and I asked him if it would have been the week prior to that he raised it with Inspector Kay, and he said, I believe so. And he confirmed that in the Intelligence Department at the time he thought were based in headquarters at Glenrothes, but Special Branch were more of a national organisation rather than Fife-based. Can I ask you if you have a recollection of a discussion with former Constable Alan Payton about a threat to a female officer?
I have no recollection of that at all. There were documented such a statement from an officer and a previous life in the police. I've got quite an extensive intelligence background, so I definitely can't recall that.
So if you had been approached by a constable at muster and asked to carry out some further investigations regarding the Intelligence Department or to approach Special Branch, what would you have done?
I would ask him to articulate it on an email or a memo and send it to myself. I'd ask him to do some basic checks on SID, etc. or anything else he can, and once he gathered me that small intel package, I would have forwarded it on to the Intel Department and copied Nicola Shepherd in, and probably Operations Super at minimum.
Do you have any recollection of doing anything like that at all, just shortly prior to the 3rd of May?
That's a total surprise, to be honest.
Can I ask you about a phone call that you had with Inspector Stewart? Now, there's a transcript of this call at SBPI 00113. I don't know if you have that, Mr. Kay, but we've got a recording of this.
Is it on the spreadsheet?
No, it's not on the spreadsheet.
Oh, okay.
What we'll do is we will play this phone call and you'll be able to hear it as we play it, and then I'll ask you one or two questions at the end. All right?
Okay.
And if you can't hear it at any time, please just speak up and we'll try and fix that. Thank you.
Okay.
Hello, Stevie Stewart speaking.
Hi, Kate. How are you doing? Stevie K here.
Hi, how you doing? Are you wanting that incident restricted?
Yeah, I'm just thinking.
Yeah, we talked about it earlier on today, but we're obviously not getting an update on what's happened to the mail. But
The last update I had was they were 38 minutes working on them, and they'll go to 45.
right, okay, doke. That's not so good then. Right, we'll get it view rated. We'll need to get names of who all needs access to it then, in that case. I don't know if you want to tell me who needs...
To give Chief Super Gary McEwen access to it.
Wait a second. Chief Soup Gary McEwen.
Chief Inspector Nicky Shepherd.
CI Nicky Shepherd.
Chief Inspector Chris Stones.
CI Chris Stones.
Myself, Stephen K. PH.
PI Stephen K.
And D.I. Robson.
DI. What do you know his first name or? No.
Colin Robson.
Colin Robson.
And P.I. Jane Coombs.
I know. Jane Coom.
If I need any for some other illustrious gaffer like you,
Right.
you know what it's like.
Aye. How's the cop? Is the cop alright?
The full shifts off the street.
The full shift off the street?
All right, yeah.
Aye.
So, and we'll get basic trim in the Federation rep and that's coming.
Want to speak to the pipe inspector? Alright, I've got Kay Finlay from media. She's on call at Fetis. In fact, I'll get is it a number and I'll get her to phone you or something like that?
You phone me on.
Oh, she's apparently knows the number she can phone you on.
Perfect.
Right. Okay, but so they're all off the. I mean, the job's very sketchy in terms of what happened. But I see the previous job that the woman's obviously phoned in saying that there's been some kind of disturbance or domestic. But I mean, I don't know the geography there, but the guys must have been. Was the station nearby? They were on that. They were on that so quickly. It was too quick actually. I don't know even if he's heard.
No.
Was he?
What happened? It came over and I just brought up the stay safe thing you got on.
Mm-hmm.
I was on the phone to another sales and getting my number.
Mm-hmm.
And they were en route and they got told be safe and we heard like ARV and the dog and that.
Mm-hmm.
All of a sudden,
The emergency button goes.
Basically, I think we stopped. He's basically he's the size of a house.
Is he?
He just ran at them.
Oh dear. Aye.
We had a couple of cops who are probably sitting 18, 19%, and generally speaking, if they weren't there, I try to think what would have happened.
Yeah, and did he have knives on him type thing?
He ran at them with a knife.
Oh, has he? See, that's, you know, oh dear me. That, I mean, for me, that's an ARV job, but it's just, you know, but and a dog job, but you just, it's obviously the time they've obviously come across it.
Dynamics-wise, there was no time. He'd
No.
put the mind up for them.
Yeah, aye. And the thing is, as well, when you've got someone going down the street with a knife, you still have, my view is, cops still have to go, even if they park at the end, stop at the car at the end of the street to say, I can see him, this is what's happening with him. But see, when you look at the timestamps, I suspect it's even happened quicker than the timestamps, but it's over in 3 minutes or something like that almost for the first call.
See if you even get in there to make an initial assessment, to do the basics of guard watch and patrol.
Yeah.
It's fucking happened.
That's it, it's done and dusted.
He's basically just went for them, eh?
Yeah. Well, that's so dear.
I haven't seen him, but
yeah.
he's a decent size unit.
Is he? Well, hopefully they're alright and he's alright type thing, but right, okay, we'll get that view rated just now. And Kate Finlay, she's at media at Fetis, her extension is. She said she's going to phone you.
Right, I get Kate to phone me and I'll be fine.
Right, okay, I'll get that. Okay, cheers mate, bye-bye.
To hear that, Mr. Kay.
Yep.
Yeah. And did you recognise the voices?
Yeah, that's me, yeah.
We've heard evidence already that this was a telephone conversation between you and Inspector Stewart, who was the ACR duty inspector, and that it was at 12 minutes past 9 on the 3rd of May 2015. Do you remember this call?
Yeah. Now that I heard that, I do remember it, yes.
When this call was made, were you back at Kirkcaldy Police Office?
Yeah, it sounds like I'm just back at the desk.
I'd like to ask you about an expression that you use during the call. It says, he's the size of a house. And then you say afterwards, he just ran at them. If they weren't there, I dread to think what would have happened. He ran at them with a knife. Dynamics-wise, there was no time. When you use the expression, he's the size of a house, can you tell us why you used that expression?
Yeah, that's not terminology I would use. So I would have took that from the briefing from PS Maxwell, I would believe. But I know what he was saying from. If he's describing it to me, I would describe him as being well built. He's a unit in sports terms. He's muscly, powerful, athletic. That's what I would take from that.
So in using the expression, he's the size of a house, are you suggesting that those are words that Maxwell used when he gave you the briefing?
Yeah. That's not my terminology, but I get it. It's in sports language. He would be a unit, he'd be powerful, he'd be athletic, certainly muscular.
Right. And also when you said he ran at them with a knife, where did that information come from? I know that by the time you arrived at Hayfield Road, Mr. Bio was away in the ambulance. So when you say he ran at them with a knife, where was that from?
Same again, when we went back to the briefing I got from PS Maxwell, was that not covered in that? Same again, it's, I don't know if it's the Whispers game at Christmas, and by the time I've got it, it's not quite as it is, but I'd only be repeating what I've been informed by, because obviously even the ACR doesn't know, so I would only be regurgitating what's being passed to me.
Looking at that expression now, he's the size of a house, do you have any views about whether that was an expression that was used because Mr. Bio was black?
I don't follow. I don't know how that correlates into the colour of his skin.
Are you aware of racial stereotypes and language that is used to reinforce those racial stereotypes? That black men are perhaps bigger, stronger, more aggressive, more violent?
No, it's something I couldn't say I've been aware of or could recall. I'm quite healthily into sports, various sports, and I've never knew that to be mentioned or being portrayed.
We've heard that Mr. Bio, in fact, was 5'10" and 12 stone 10 pounds. Is that a size and height that you would consider to be the size of a house?
No, I would disagree with that phrase, but I also wouldn't disagree if I was getting told he was a unit or powerful.
Right. Can I ask you about diversity training that you've had in your career? We've seen some of your training records, and we can put these on the screen. PS 18496. And we can see that on the 14th of February 2001, there we are, sort of a third to half of the way down that page. E&D, perhaps equality and diversity awareness, FC, 14th February to 15th February 2001, that you had diversity awareness training, which seems to have perhaps spanned those dates. Apart from that, what training have you had on equality and diversity over the years of your service?
None that I recall would extend to a 2-day course like that.
Do you remember this course in 2001?
I knew it had diversity training, but I didn't realise it was 22 years ago.
And since that date, have you ever undergone any diversity training, either compulsory or voluntary?
I've touched on it on personal football coaching badges. I've touched on diversity and mental health, but not specifically for that, but I've certainly come across it.
Is that external to the police service?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And do you remember anything about the training you had in 2001?
No.
When you think about your involvement with the community in your job, either in your role as PIO in 2015 or prior to that, before your promotions, had you dealt with a number of people of different ethnicities, different nationalities?
Yes, well, I was a custody sergeant, so I would be booking in all nationalities and dealing with a whole host of people.
Had you been given any diversity awareness training when you became a custody sergeant?
I can't back this up, but I'm tempted to say yes, for being culturally aware and diets and sort of events in the year, etc. But I don't know if that will be documented anywhere. But I certainly could remember that 10, 12 years ago.
When you say culturally aware, is this your own general cultural awareness rather than specific training that you were provided?
No, I'm sure, as I say, depending on what nationality got locked up for their diet, what they can and cannot eat, and if obviously their beliefs on praying, etc. I'm almost certain we got some form of input on that, even if it was just maybe email correspondence to self-read. But I can recall getting some of that, well, a long time ago, to be fair.
Do you remember anything about that, other than what you've just told us?
No, not that, to be fair.
Right. Can I ask you to look at your inquiry statement again, please, paragraph 41. And this paragraph reads, the demographics and the people you're dealing with are different, so the policing style might be different to others. I didn't deal with it enough to put my slant on it. I was only in or out for certain instances in the drug enforcement team. So my clientele were drug abusers, so I couldn't speak about the rest. Let's look at the preceding paragraph as well, please. Where you mentioned that you were in the drug enforcement team and worked from various stations. You knew Kirkcaldy, you were in Methil, and you said the crime rate would be different and it's going to be higher in Kirkcaldy than it is in St Andrews. Can I ask you, what did you mean in paragraph 41 about the policing style being different to others depending on the demographics and the people you were dealing with?
Obviously, I'm trying to look back onto when I got asked this question. He's obviously asked me if I knew Kirkcaldy Police Station prior to me going there, and I've said yes with dipping in and out on the drug enforcement team. He's obviously asked me another question going back, that the demographics, to answer that's pretty much common sense. When you're urban and rural, you have different crime, you have different people, so you deal with people different. If you're in a busy town like Kirkcaldy, is a different clientele to St Andrews. Fucking, it's an affluent area. They'll get a base different in Inverkeithing, and it's only 2 miles. So I would expect a good cop to deliver their service delivery to suit who they're dealing with. Because as I say, if you're out urban, it will be different to what it is in the town or if you're in the school. That's all that is.
Do the differences include the ethnicity of the public in these areas?
No.
Can I ask you another question about when you went back to KPO, the Kirkcaldy Police Office? Did anyone raise concerns at that time about potential allegations of racism being raised in relation to the events at Hayfield Road?
No, not that I'm aware of.
Was there any discussion at that time about the fact that Mr. Bio was black?
No. Not overly I'm aware of.
Thank you. Can you just give me a moment, please, Mr.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kay. That completes my questions.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Kay, I wonder if you could help me with something.
Of course, sir.
Can I take you back to the beginning of the police involvement in this incident?
Yes.
We know from the evidence that the controller and the ACR dispatched Constables Short and Tomlinson to the incident.
Yeah.
And we know that Sergeant Maxwell told all units to attend and asked for an AVR and a dog.
Yeah.
And you've told us that you were the PIO in the division, and you were in the station in Kirkcaldy, and you were watching the storm log, and you were listening to the airwave. And I think you also said you were on the phone to Chief Inspector Stones. We also know that Inspector Stewart came on the airwave and asked or instructed feedback from the first set attending. And then we know that there was contact between these officers and Sheku, and it all led into the restraint. Now, during that period that I've covered in that analysis, who was in command of the police response to the incident?
Well, to put it this way, sir, when that came up, due to the fact I've only sent one unit, I would imagine the call taker has put up a knife incident, mail, etc., etc. So they've sent one unit, so which is pretty much protocol. So as I say, a lot of these things we go to and they're not actually there, it's not actually happening. So I don't think I'm being remiss on saying that's quite comfortable. But the previous 3 or 4 rapid calls and the escalation, Sergeant Maxwell has obviously sent other officers to go. That's still good. If I chose to step in, it would be once we further got all the information. But as soon as the knife's mentioned, then it's HCR who take control. They take supremacy over everything else, because that's policy and that's protocol. So as soon as a knife's confirmed, it would go to them. But up with to that, because it was so fast paced, PC Maxwell's not doing anything wrong. If that was a bit slower, I would have stepped in and done all these commands. But same again, as soon as a knife is confirmed and there, that's a firearms incident, and carte blanche goes to the ACR.
Could you just explain that a little more for me? My question is, who was in command of the police response as it developed? Was there an individual in command?
Yeah, that's Scott Maxwell. That's his team in his area. So he's in charge until myself or the ACR would take control.
In what circumstances would you take control?
When there was more information, if the knife was confirmed before ACR, if it got more complex, or if Sergeant Maxwell was there and it was heating up when he was there, I would take responsibility off him. Because at the end of the day, it would come to me anyway. I would step in if need be. But as we heard, I was on the phone to Chris Stones and another sergeant. But initially, it is his to own till it hits a certain level. Then it would come to me or the ACR inspector. But because it was so fast paced, that was still PS Maxwell's, because we didn't have any information.
At the beginning of the reporting, this was graded as a grade 1 level incident in the ACR involving a knife.
Yes.
Now, we've got...
Well, that's ACR's then.
If we just
If
hold
that's a
a
grade
moment.
1 knife, that's ACR's.
So you've got an inspector in the ACR, and you've got you as the inspector and the PIO in the division.
Yeah.
As between the two of you, in a grade 1 incident with the ACR receiving and grading it involving a knife, who's going to be in command of that situation?
ACR. They took control because it would be deemed a firearms incident.
Thank you. If you just hold on a moment, Mr. Kay, are there any Rule 9 applications? Ms. McCall. Mr. Kay, I'm going to ask him to cut the link to you briefly while I hear a submission, and then I'll come back to you. All right?
Okay. Yep.
No, Miss McCall. I think if you can come over to the I was going to say the witness seat.
There are three matters I'd like to raise, and they all relate to this witness's evidence about discussions he had with Acting Sergeant Maxwell. The first relates to a passage of evidence at page 88, lines 2 to 7. And this was about discussions about the completion of paperwork. And the witness said he couldn't recall, but
Sorry, just give me a minute to find this. Page 88, yes.
88, line 2.
Line 2.
There's a question about
Yes.
any discussions about the completion of paperwork or issuing any instructions before he went on to his other work. He said, I can't recall, but I would also be astonished if I hadn't said to Scott, that's Sergeant Maxwell, to make sure that this was in as per normal. What I wanted to put to him, given his answer I can't recall, was Sergeant Maxwell's position about that, which is answer 80 in his Rule 8 statement, in which he says Inspector K stood him down from any supervisory duties. That's the first issue. The next matter relates to, it's two matters arising out of the phone call to Inspector Stewart. And it's page 93, line 10 onwards. And it's the series of questions and answers about this expression, size of a house, which the witness now attributes to Sergeant Maxwell. That, as the chair is aware, is disputed by Sergeant Maxwell. So it was to put to him that it's not recorded in any of his statements. It's not recorded as any briefing that Sergeant Maxwell gave him. It's an expression that's never been used by Sergeant Maxwell in any statement or his evidence. It's to clarify whether the witness might be mistaken in his recollection of the source of that. And the same issue arises on page 94 at line 5 in relation to his attribution of the phrase, he ran at them with a knife, to Sergeant Maxwell. Again, it's not in the briefing recorded from Sergeant Maxwell. Sergeant Maxwell has never said it in a statement or in evidence. It's not in the radio transmissions. And as you know, sir, it's not the account of any officer at this inquiry or in any statement that at any time Mr. Bio ran at them with a knife. So it's to clarify whether he could be mistaken about that phrase being used by Sergeant Maxwell.
Yes, well, I shall allow you to ask these questions. I don't know what, technically, if Miss McCall just remains in that seat, that would work. But will you be able to see, is there a screen? No, I think you'll have to move so you see a screen. Yes.
Swap with Miss Graham, my lord.
Yes, thank you. So we can open up the link again, please.
Where will I see him?
Mr. Kay, you're going to be
Yes,
asked.
sir.
You're going to be asked some questions by Miss McCall, who is the senior counsel for Sergeant Maxwell. Do you understand?
Yeah.
Yeah, Miss McCall.
Inspector Kay, can you hear me all right?
Yes, can.
Thank you. I want to take you back to a question that you were asked by Miss Graham. And the question you were asked in relation to the completion of paperwork, including statements and use of force and spray forms.
Yeah.
She asked you, did you have any discussions about the completion of paperwork or issue any instructions before you went to get on with your other work? And your answer was, I can't recall, but I would also be astonished if I hadn't said to Scott to make sure that that was in as per normal. And you confirmed that the reference to Scott was a reference to Acting Sergeant Maxwell. What I want to do is tell you what Sergeant Maxwell's evidence before the inquiry is in relation to his interaction with you on his return to the police office. What he said in being asked about whether he received any advice or instruction from any senior officer, he said, "I was told by Inspector K that afternoon that as I had been present at and involved in the incident concerning Mr. Bio, which was now going to be subject of an inquiry, I was relieved of all managerial and supervisory duties relating to the incident concerning Mr. Bio. I was instructed that my continuing role as a sergeant was limited to monitoring the welfare of those who were in my team and that had attended the incident. On the day, Chief Inspector Conrad Trickett took over the role of post-incident manager for the incident involving Mr. Bio. This role included having oversight of the officer's completion of operational statements and relevant documentation such as use of force forms." So I recognise, Inspector K, that you said you couldn't exactly recall, and you indicated what you thought you'd done. Do you dispute what Sergeant Maxwell says about the instruction you gave him?
No, not at all. As I said, I can't recall, but I know the relationship I had with all my sergeants, especially Scott, the same station. He's very thorough, pragmatic. I actually worked with him for 9 months after that. I gave him a job assigned me later, such was his thoroughness. So I can stand corrected. But as I say, I was diluted, but due to the fact we had some form of conversation, was just due to the fact that I tried to make my standards his. So if he's been instructed for that, or I've said that, then fair enough, I'll stand corrected. But as I said, my defence, I couldn't recall it, but I knew there would be some form. And if I've been advised to say that to him, then fair enough.
All right, so I take it from that you accept what Sergeant Maxwell says and you do stand corrected. Is that right?
Well, I'm certainly not going to say he's lying, and I can't recall, so yeah.
All right, thank you. Can I ask you then 2 questions arising out of the phone call that you listened to between yourself and Inspector Stewart? And you were asked about a reference that you made in that phone call referring to Mr. Bio as the size of a house. And you say that is not terminology that you would use, and you would have took that from the briefing from DS Maxwell, I think PS Maxwell, I would believe. But from if he's describing it to me, I would describe him as being well built and so on. So you attributed that remark, size of a house, to Acting Sergeant Maxwell. Inspector K, that expression, size of a house, is not recorded in any of your statements as having been said by Sergeant Maxwell. There's no reference in your operational statement to Sergeant Maxwell even giving you a physical description of the man. The expression doesn't appear in any of Sergeant Maxwell's statements or his evidence sworn before this inquiry. Would you accept you might be mistaken that Sergeant Maxwell was the source of that expression?
Same again, I'm not going to call him a liar. It's not terminology I use, and he was the only one that gave me a full briefing, so obviously I can't 100% articulate it, but I stand by that. In my opinion, it came from him.
I think just to clarify, you also indicated you had a briefing from DS Davidson, is that right, at the scene?
Yeah, I was speaking to both of them at the same time, as per my statement.
All right. Let me ask you then about another expression which you were asked about from that same phone call, and that was that he ran at them with a knife. That expression is not recorded in any of your statements to this inquiry. It's not recorded in the briefing that you noted from Sergeant Maxwell in your operational statement. It's not in any of Sergeant Maxwell's statements. It's not in the radio transmissions. And let me be clear, it is not the account of any officer who was at the scene in their evidence to this inquiry or in any statement they've given at any time. Do you accept that you could be mistaken in saying that Sergeant Maxwell said to you he ran at them with a knife?
Yeah, I could see I've got my statement then for me ran at them. Possibly every time we go back to the station when things had calmed down, it was a bit more clearer, hence it's not mentioned on my statement.
What I'm asking is whether you could be mistaken that Sergeant Maxwell at any time said to you he ran at them with a knife, given that's never been his position or the position of any officer who attended the incident.
Yeah, it could be mistaken, but also can't 100% be sure.
All right. Thank you, sir.
Mr. Kay, thank you very much for giving evidence to the inquiry. The link will now be cut and you'll be free to go about your own business.
Okay, thank you.
Now, Ms. Graham, should we make a start on Constable Masterton? I'll adjourn briefly to allow him to be introduced. Good afternoon, Mr. Masterton. I'm sorry you've been kept waiting. Will you say the words of the affirmation after me, please? I solemnly, sincerely and truly
I solemnly, sincerely and truly
declare and affirm
declare and affirm
that I will tell the truth,
that I will tell the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Miss Graham.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Mr. Masterton. You're Scott Masterton.
Yes.
What age are you?
57.
And you're formerly a police constable with Police Scotland.
Yes.
And you've retired.
Yes.
How many years service did you have when you retired?
30.
And when did you retire?
December 2017.
You will see in front of you that there is a folder, and please feel free to open it. It should contain hard copies of the statements and documents that you've prepared for the inquiry and some other statements. If you want to look through that at any time, please feel free to do so. When I refer you to something, it'll come up on the screen. But if you think there's something else that's important, please let me know and we can have that on the screen too. Look first at the first document, which should be a PERC statement. A statement given by you to PERC, the PERC on the 6th of July 2015. You'll see that on the screen now, but you should also have a copy in your folder. And it's the 6th of July 2015 at 14:40, and it was taken by DSI Edward Miles within the ACR at Bilston Glen in Edinburgh. Do you see that?
Yes.
Do you remember giving this statement to the PERC?
Yes.
Did you do your best when you spoke to the PERC to be as accurate as you could in your recollection and to tell the truth?
Yes.
Thank you. And can we look at your first inquiry statement, SBPI 00067? Again, you'll see a copy in your folder. This is a statement given to the inquiry and taken on the 11th of March this year. Do you recognise that?
Yes.
And if we look at the final page, you'll see that it was signed on the 2nd of May this year. Now, although we can't see your signature on the screen, there should be a signature from you appended to every page on the hard copy.
Yes.
And if we can look at the last paragraph on that, paragraph 34, it was said, I believe the facts stated in this witness statement are true. I understand that this statement may form part of the evidence before the inquiry and be published on the inquiry's website. And that was your understanding at
Yes.
the time. And then can we look at a second inquiry statement, SBPI 00194, taken on the 9th of November. And again, do you recognise that as your supplementary statement?
Yes.
And on the final page at paragraph 22, I believe, we see again you've signed it on the 16th of November, and on your own hard copy of this statement, you'll see that you've signed every page.
Yes.
And again, the final paragraph is in the same terms, paragraph 22. And again, you believe the facts to be true, and you understood it would form part of the evidence for the inquiry and published on our website.
Yes.
Thank you. And then can I also ask you to look briefly at something we call a combined audio and visual timeline. It's a spreadsheet. You should have a hard copy of that, say 3 size. I don't know if you've looked at any of the other evidence, Mr. Masterton, but it is a timeline. On the left, you'll see columns showing the times of events. You will see just left to centre transcripts of airwaves transmissions by the police and others at ACR. And on the right is the CCTV, a thumbnail sketch. Do you see that? I may be referring you to passages in that, but I'll explain as we go through. You worked at Bilston Glen, ACR, as a controller, am I right, for about 16 months as at May 2015.
Yes.
And I'd like to just briefly get a picture of the ACR and your role at the ACR at that time. So a 999 call would come in from a member of the public. Who was the first port of call for that? Who would take that call? Who would handle that call as it came in?
What we called the call takers. So they received the calls from the public and they would initiate a job on our command and control system.
And when you say initiate a job, do you mean they'd put something onto the computer? We've heard mention of storm and call cards and incidents. Would be that the sort of thing they'd create?
Yes, if it was a job that needed that, sometimes it might be a job that would be passed to the council or other agencies. But if it was a police job, they would start up an incident, yes.
So of course a 999 call could come in, but it might be for the fire service or some Coast Guard, something along those lines.
That's probably filtered out before it gets to the police by the BT operator that takes the 999 call. So they would ask, do you want police, fire, ambulance, or what emergency service do you want?
So the call comes into the ACR from a member of the public, the call taker picks it up and then puts something onto the system.
Yes.
And I think you said in your statement that there's a process called grading
Yes.
of the calls. Can you give us a brief explanation of what the different grades are?
I'll be struggling now, but I think there was 5 grades. A grade 1 being the most serious. Grade 5, I think, was no police involvement. Grade 1 calls are essentially classed as risk to life. A grade 2 call would be something that requires police resources in a fairly quick order, and grade 3 and 4 obviously further down the line, so when resources become free. Grade 1 and 2 are the more serious ones.
And of those, grade 1 is the most serious?
Yes.
We've heard others say that would classify an immediate threat to life. Would you agree with that now?
That's generally what I would consider a grade 1 call to be, yes.
If they were dealing with a knife incident, so an allegation that someone had a knife, would that always be a grade 1 call, or would it sometimes be a grade 2 call?
I think it would pretty much always be a grade 1 call. If they were using a knife in any kind of threatening manner, a grade 1 call certainly.
How many calls would you get, say, in a week that involved an allegation that someone had a knife? How common was it?
It was relatively common. I generally worked on the Leith desk in Edinburgh City, so it was fairly common. I would think the wee statistics somewhere, but I would have guessed one or two a week.
Right. For the call takers, how long would they take to answer a call from a member of the public and then input something into the computer system?
It's pretty quick. I would have thought less than a minute to get that initial job on and across to me. So for a grade 1 call, they would put the barest of details on very, very quickly and transfer that job immediately across. And then they would continue to talk to the person who had phoned in and get further information. So the job would come across to me, I would immediately say it's a grade 1 call, but there would be the barest of details on it. And then I know that they would be continuing to talk to the caller and they would put further information on as they got it. But it's to give me as much opportunity as possible to get someone to respond as quickly as possible.
Was the priority to get information to you as a controller as soon as possible?
Yes.
I was going to ask you if the call taker is putting things into the computer as they're still on the call, or do they wait for the call to finish and then do the
No, they'll be doing it as they speak.
So it's in real time, if you
Yes.
like. They're inputting things into the computer system.
Yes,
And that's an ongoing process as the call continues.
yes,
And they're doing that, they've graded the calls, and then you as a controller start to receive information on the system.
yes,
So let's just think first of all about the setup. You've said in your statements that at the ACR there are 4 pods, or there were at that time, and they had 6 controllers in each pod.
I think technically it should have 6.
It should have
Don't
6.
think I ever saw that, no.
All right, so sometimes they might be short-staffed.
Yes,
Right, but in theory there were 4 pods, and this is for the East Division. Is that right?
yes.
4
Okay.
pods. Sorry, I'm interrupting.
Sorry, I can't quite remember the area we covered. I think it was Lothians, the Borders, Fife was where we covered, yeah.
And each pod related to a different area.
Yes.
And within the pod, the controllers themselves, how was the work allocated to each controller? Was that
would-
geographical?
Yes, you would cover a geographical area.
So each of the up to 6 controllers would have a different area to cover.
Well, for example, on the pod that I worked, generally in Leith, you would have 3 controllers, which covered 3 geographical areas, and you would have one person who, well, hopefully you'd have one person who was like a spare and would do other things while you were managing jobs. So they would maybe phone ambulance, do other bits and pieces of background information, checking computers for intelligence and things like that, and covering you when you went for a break. So if you went to the lunch or the toilet or anything like that, they would cover for you.
So your computer screen wasn't left unattended
No.
if you had a break for any reason?
Well, it could be, because generally we didn't have that extra person. So one of the other controllers would have to also take over command of your area, and so they'd be covering 2 geographical areas at a time.
And on the 3rd of May 2015, am I right in saying that the pod you were working in was Fife,
Yes,
and the area that you were covering as a controller was Kirkcaldy?
yes,
Now, as I understand it, each pod has a supervisor,
yes,
and was that a sergeant?
yes.
So on the 3rd of May 2015, who was your supervisor, who was your sergeant?
Sergeant Stephen Bissett,
Is it?
I think.
Where were they located when everyone was there in the pod? Were they nearby, or were they in a separate area?
No, there's the pods are in a big circle, and the supervisor's area is a raised bit in the centre of the circle.
So they can be present when the calls are coming to the controller.
Yes.
What does the sergeant see in relation to, obviously you've got up to 6 controllers in that pod, what can the sergeant see at the same time as yourself?
Exactly the same as us.
Do they have a screen in front of them the same as you?
Yes,
And do you also have a radio at the same time as watching the screen?
yes,
And does that allow you to hear airwaves transmissions, but also to see the storm cards or the incident cards coming up on the screen?
yes.
Thank you. And what was the role of the sergeant supervisor in relation to each pod?
Basically an oversight of the jobs that were coming in, an oversight of us to make sure we were doing our job and on top of the jobs and top of the resources.
Can you seek advice from them if necessary?
Yes,
Who was the supervisor of the sergeant? Who was the overall supervisor?
that's the control room inspector.
We've heard evidence that on the 3rd of May 2015, the duty inspector was Inspector Stewart.
Yes.
Do you remember that? Was he the most senior person he had overview of the ACR?
Yes.
Was there any other person in that chain that I've missed out? We've talked about the call takers, the controller, which was your role, the sergeant and the duty inspector.
No, that's it.
Is that it? When a grade 1 call came in, so it's come into the call taker, they've graded it a grade 1 call, highest grade. Tell us what that looks like when it comes onto your screen as a controller.
It's a while ago, so I can't remember exactly what comes on screen, but there's some kind of job pops up on the screen with a description of the job, where it is, and for a grade 1 call, there's a flashing red icon, something just to give you that extra bit of prompt that this is a grade 1 an emergency.
Does that attract your attention, the
Yes.
flashing red? What does the sergeant see when a grade 1 call comes in?
Same.
The same. Tell us about the inspector. What comes on his screen when a grade 1 call comes in?
The same.
The same. And do they come up on all 3 of those screens at the same time, or is there a time delay?
No, they come up on all 3 at the same time.
Were there any targets, as far as you remember, of the time it would take you to deal with a grade 1 call?
There were, but I can't remember what they were. I think minutes. You know,
Minutes. Not
Yeah.
seconds, minutes.
to actually pick up the call or
To
resource
pick up the
call.
call and make a decision about the call.
I can't honestly remember, but yeah,
Maybe another witness will be able to help
Yeah.
us with that. So let's look at your inquiry statement, paragraphs 14, 15 and 16. And I think actually it's let me just check, I think it's yes, it's this one. This is the second statement. So you'll see as we go through this, line 6. For a grade 1 call in particular, there's no consideration. It's all hands on deck. The only real consideration is who's nearest to it, the location of the call. Basically, for a grade 1 call, everybody is cancelled from whatever they're doing to go to this call until we've found out exactly what's happening and until we know we're in control of it. And then at paragraph 15 of the statement, I think you say everyone goes as fast as they can. And then at paragraph 16, you say a grade 1 call is a threat to life, so it's an urgent call, it's the most serious kind of call. Everyone drops everything and goes. So is a grade 1 call always treated with urgency?
yes.
You've said in paragraph 16, and if we could maybe go down the page slightly. Sorry, it's spanning 2 pages. If we could just go up again, sorry about that. It says, we're talking about grade 1 call. You know, we don't have many of them. You can go many days without a grade 1 call. On a Friday, Saturday night, sometimes you'll get 2 or 3 a night, sort of thing, but they're not a particularly common thing. And at particular times of day as well. So it's very, very rare to get a grade 1 call at 7 o'clock in the morning. For a grade 1 call, I should be on top of it. My supervisor should be on top of it. His supervisor should be on top of it. Because, for instance, if it's a firearms thing, then the duty inspector in the ACR has to then start getting firearms officers geared up to attend. I'd like to just go through that paragraph with you in a little bit more detail. You've said that it's a very, very rare to get a grade 1 call at 7 in the morning. What do you mean by very, very rare?
Grade 1 calls are usually in the latter half of the day, quite often Friday, Saturday evenings, weekends, sort of thing. It's just unusual to get a grade 1 call of that nature at that time. I think it was a Sunday morning.
After 7 in the morning on Sunday the 3rd of May 2015.
Yeah.
So do you remember in your 18 months at the ACR, had you had any grade 1 calls, knife calls at that sort of time on a Sunday morning?
I couldn't swear 100%, but not to my recollection, no.
When you said the supervisor should be on top of it and his supervisor should be on top of it, what did you mean by that?
Well, we've all seen a grade 1 call has come in, so I need to be thinking about resourcing it, and because there probably wouldn't have been another grade 1 call at that time anywhere else in the whole area that we're covering. The sergeant and the inspector, I would expect to see that and be looking at it straight away to see if it was something, for example, is it a firearms job? The inspector would need to know immediately, so he should be looking at that immediately to assess whether he's got to consider firearms.
Could you explain to us, you've received this grade 1 call after 7 in the morning on a Sunday. You think that's probably the only one in Fife, the area, and it's flashing red. And tell us about the process, the thought process that you're going through as you receive that call.
I have a quick look at the job to see what the nature of it is, and then I'm basically looking to see what resources I have that I can send to that job. And I will call up on the radio and start allocating units to that job.
And when you say start allocating units to that job, what does that mean?
I'll call them up on the radio, tell them details about the job, and then on the computer I will allocate them to the job.
So is a unit like a response team in a police station somewhere?
Yes.
And will you be picking the best located team to respond to that particular incident?
Initially, but for something like this, it's a case of once I've got that first unit, it's everybody. I would be concentrating on getting a radio message out, but I know that everybody out there is going to hear that radio message, so I'll concentrate on getting one allocated unit en route to it. I don't really need to probably go through every single resource and say go, because I know that they're all going to be running out the door en route to this job, so I can start to look at other information that's coming in about the job to pass that out.
As far as you're aware, will other police officers understand a grade 1 call is high priority?
Yes.
Are you doing a risk assessment at that moment when you're deciding what units to send out?
A very, very basic, but it's a grade 1 call. Members of the public have called in describing what seems to be a serious incident, and it's the police's job to go to and find out what's actually going on. So yeah, it's already been graded as a grade 1 by the system. It needs police action and attendance. So there's not really too much in the way of risk assessment now.
And at that time, is any part of your thought process considering whether to send one unit, perhaps with 2 officers, or all units?
For a job like this, it would be every single unit I can get my hands on. Yeah.
And you'll do that as quickly as possible?
Yes.
Is any part of that process considering the experience of the officers that you're deploying, or their gender, or their physical characteristics in any way?
No, I, as I said, I generally worked on the Leith pod in Edinburgh. I had some knowledge of the officers involved there, but for that area in Kirkcaldy, I had no idea of the officers' length of service, their gender or anything. We all put on the uniform and we go to the jobs.
And all of the police officers are expected to attend?
Yes.
And at that time, the person deploying the officers and making those decisions is you as the controller?
Yes.
Was there ever any occasion where that responsibility was removed from you, or the sergeant or the inspector interfered in that part of the process with you?
On this instant or in general?
Or just in general?
Not really, no. Occasionally, if there was a shortage in other areas, the sergeant might come on and take some of my resources away somewhere else. But that kind of thing. But other than that, no, not really.
No. So you're responsible as controller for taking the initial decisions to deploy officers? Yes. And to then arrange for that deployment over the radio?
Yes.
Thank you. Can I ask you to look at the spreadsheet? I said a moment ago we'd come on to this. And you'll see that if we start at 716, so page 1 really of the spreadsheet, you'll see on the left hand side that we have timings down in the left hand column, and then in the second column it's audio timings. Do you see that?
Yes.
And you see at 7:16:22, do you have that?
Yes.
It says Con 1, control for 4-1 Charlie. Ashley Tomlinson then says go ahead, and then at 7:16:32 it says Con 1, I need you to divert out to Henry Road, a disturbance ongoing, male armed with a knife, African looking male, chasing someone, maybe carrying a knife, described as big with muscles, about 6 foot tall, wearing a white t-shirt and dark coloured jeans. There's another job coming in about it, stand by. Con 1, we've heard it suggested that that's you, is that correct?
Yes.
And so if we see Con 1 in this transcript, that will be you
Yes.
transmitting. We will also see later that there's someone called Con 2, and we've heard suggested that that was Michelle Hutchison. Do you remember her?
Yes.
Who was Michelle Hutchison?
She works as an assistant to the inspector in the what we called East Overview.
And was she working in the Fife pod that day, or was she in a separate area?
She's in a separate area.
So not part of your pod,
No.
not part of Fife. We'll come on to her later. So Con 1, you're making that transmission, and we see, as far as I'm aware, this is the first transmission that you make, and at that stage you're diverting, I need you to divert to Henry Road. And it was Ashley Tomlinson that responded and said, go ahead. As I understand it, Ashley Tomlinson and an officer called Nicole Short were together that day, partnering each other, and they were initially deployed to Hayfield Road. Do you have any recollection of that?
No.
So it would appear that on that day there was one unit sent initially, and then you'll see on page 2 at 7:17, sorry, at 7:16, but at the top of page 2, 7:16:59, PC Tomlinson says, that's received control. Is there other units that can assist us? So there was a request within a matter of seconds from Ashley Tomlinson for other units that could assist. And did you respond to that?
I don't think I have responded to that. Essentially, I would see that as a message, both to me, but also to their colleagues, letting them know that, can anyone else out there come and help us? I'm busy reading the jobs that are coming in, so I don't know how quickly the other job comes in, but there's also other information coming in on the job. So I probably did not respond to that. As I say, essentially, I'm seeing it as, yes, a call to me if I can answer it, but if not, it's a call going out to her colleagues. Or is it, sorry, a he or a she?
Ashley Tomlinson is a man.
That's a call going out to his colleagues. Can anyone else that's free come and help us?
Would it have been possible for you at that point to say immediately all units to Hayfield Road?
Yes.
But you didn't think that was necessary at that time?
No.
Was there a reason for that, or?
Just because I'm so busy reading the job, I know from 27, 28 years of experience that every police officer in the building will be running out the building, getting into a car and en route to that job.
So will they all know that it's a grade 1 call?
Yes.
How do they know it?
Did I not say that?
Well, if we look at 71632, you say, I need you to divert to Henry Road, and there's a disturbance ongoing, a male armed with a knife. But there's nothing there about it being a grade 1 call.
No. Quite often we would say a grade 1 call, but I haven't said it on that instance.
Right.
But they would know from the nature that it's a male armed with a knife that it's a grade 1 call.
Right. So they would know from the nature of the content.
Yes.
So anyone listening to the radio would recognise
Yes.
the threat level.
Yes.
And then very quickly at 7:17:04, you come back on the airwaves again and you say, there's another grade 1 call coming in for the Victoria Road, Kirkcaldy.
Yes.
Male armed with a knife, male in possession of a large knife, black male wearing white t-shirt and jacket walking along the street with a large knife in his right hand, about a 9-inch blade.
Yes.
So by the time this call, this airwaves transmission is made, so within a matter of seconds, you've made it clear that's another grade 1 call coming in.
Yes.
And you've emphasised the reference here to a knife, a large knife, and a 9-inch blade.
Yes.
And what's your understanding of how officers will interpret that message?
That we've got a serious incident ongoing.
I
suppose also that this is now a second call from the public, and so there's something a wee bit more, if it's just one call from the public, but once you start getting 2 or 3 or 4 calls in rapid succession, there's something a bit more going on.
Does it have more? We've heard some evidence that people took that as corroboration, or it gave the calls more credibility because there were multiple calls coming
Yes.
in from different members of the public
Yes.
about a similar situation.
Yes.
And so is that something that you would agree with if officers have told us that they gave more emphasis to the multiple number of calls that were coming in?
Yes, I would say so, and it's probably quite indicative as well that it's taken place in the public's view. It's not in a house, it's not in a building or an enclosed space, it's out in view of the public somewhere, and a number of people are witnessing this and feeling, okay, I need to phone the police.
Mm-hmm. And is that indicating an increased level of risk or threat?
I would say so, yes.
And then we see further down that page 2 of the spreadsheet, that at 7:17:23, Acting Police Sergeant Scott Maxwell makes an airwaves transmission. Control from 411. I want all units to attend, that bearing in mind officer safety, is there an ARV and a dog as well, please? And
Yes.
so this appears to be the first mention of all units being called. we've heard that Acting Police Sergeant Maxwell was the sergeant in charge of the response team 4.
Yes.
Which included PCs Tomlinson and Short. And he's calling for all units, and he's making a request for an ARV and a dog.
Yes.
So again, in terms of the seriousness with which these calls are being treated, does that emphasise the importance of this call?
Yes.
And we've heard ARV is armed response vehicle, and that in fact it would, not everyone's permitted to deploy an ARV. What was your authority in relation to deploying an ARV?
None.
You weren't allowed?
No.
Was that for Inspector Stewart?
Yes.
Could Sergeant Bissett deploy an ARV?
No.
So it has to be Inspector Stewart?
Yes.
What could you do in relation to this request for an ARV? What was within your remit?
I could possibly reiterate the message up to the control room inspector, but I know he'll be listening out. I know they'll have heard the job. I know they'll have seen the job. So I don't want to take up unnecessary airtime in an emergency situation like this. That's about all I could do.
And how did you know that Inspector Stewart would have been on top of this job?
I couldn't know 100% because he's in a separate part of the building from me.
You can't see him from where you are?
No.
But you've just given evidence that the grade 1 call comes in, the flashing light comes on, the red light, and that's on his screen at the same time as yours.
Yes.
And Sergeant Bissett's.
Yes.
And tell us what your authority was in relation to making arrangements for a dog unit to attend.
To be honest, I can't 100% remember now. At this point, we had transitioned to Police Scotland. We used to have an enormous amount more dog handlers, and back in those days, I would have been able, I think, to call up a dog handler, and a dog handler was free resource it myself. But we were down to a handful of dog handlers covering the whole of Scotland. Dog handlers were getting sent from Edinburgh to Inverness, etc. So I think it was certainly the supervisors, the sergeant supervisors, and that would arrange dog handlers. It might have even gone up as high as the inspector to arrange dog handlers. They had become such a rare resource.
And then as we look down page 2 of the transcript, we see various messages from PC Alan Payton, so another officer, saying he's heading there and asking about the 2 separate locuses. We'll go to Victoria Road before Henry Road. Was there some confusion or question about where the officers were to attend?
Yes. I don't know whether they would have been from their point of view, but from my point of view, because I didn't know the local area, I was just having to pass out what was coming in as reported by the witnesses. So they had reported Victoria Road and Henry Road. Obviously the local officers would know if those were 2 roads that are sitting right next door to each other or whether they're a mile apart. If it was a mile apart, obviously, we might have actually 2 separate incidents going here.
On your computer screen, do you have any access to local information yourself, such as whether 2 roads are close together or they're in the same area?
Yes, there was some kind of mapping system, but you had to open up a separate application to get that. Yeah.
How easy was that to access?
Not easy in the time frame that we had here. So it's not an instant process. You only had like 1 small screen to do everything on, so it would mean covering up the screen that you were looking at. So.
And you've described to us how the call takers are continuing to add information to the screen.
Yes.
So if you were to access any of that local information, would that stop the call takers' data? That would no longer be visible to you?
Yes.
Who were you dependent on for local information?
The local officers.
And then we see that also there's a Samantha Davidson comes onto the airwaves. She's also attending. And you come on and give further information about the streets in Kirkcaldy. And then PC Payton talks about the Victoria Road is probably incorrect.
Yes.
And then at 7:19:12, Scott Maxwell says, control from 411, is there any update from ARV or dogs unit over? So he's requested that at 7:17 and 23, and at 7:19:12, he's requesting an update.
Yes.
And by that stage, you say at 7:19:17, I believe a dog unit is en route.
Yes.
And Con 2, Michelle Hutchinson, we've heard, says, be aware organising an ARV as well, stand by. What's been going on behind the scenes after Scott Maxwell makes the request for an ARV and a dog unit before you make this transmission at 7:19 and Michelle Hutchinson says that at 7:19?
So basically, we're looking to try and get a dog handler, and I've said I believe a dog handler is en route. I think that's probably because someone has put an entry on the job saying that a dog handler is allocated. The ARV bit, I would suggest that means that the area, the ACR inspector is currently looking at it and deciding whether it will merit an ARV going.
So you are, although you can't see him, you're assuming that the inspector is helping with this incident.
Yes.
And are you also able to see Sergeant Bissett? Is he also helping?
I couldn't know. The way the pods work, although they're all in a big circle around the central bit where the supervisors sit, the pods themselves are little circles. So if you happen to be sitting on a desk, you could be facing the sergeant, or you could have your back towards him. So I had my back towards him on this one.
Right. And then can I ask you to look at your statement from the 11th of March 2022? This is your first inquiry statement. And to look at paragraph 24, just before we leave the issue of the dogs unit. You say, whilst I was allocating resources to this incident, I can see from the incident 0745 that East Overview 1 is showing as allocating a dog unit at 7:18:38. The dog unit was SD10. Another dog unit, SD18, was mobilised also at 0721 by East Overview 3, who is a supervisor. It does not say where they were coming from, but probably far away. I'm aware from the combined airwaves transcript that one of the dog handlers mentions he's coming from Edinburgh. Again, prior to Police Scotland, we knew where all these dog handlers, and we had our own dog handlers. But once Police Scotland came along, you could be sending a dog handler from Edinburgh to Inverness, believe it or not. So just to be clear about this, the incident 0745, that's not the time, that's the incident number, is it?
Yes.
And who are East Overview 1 and East Overview 3? Who are they?
Well, it's going to be two of the three people in East Overview, so I wouldn't be able to say specifically which one was which, but there's an inspector, sergeant and an assistant. So I would have thought that East Overview 1 was probably the inspector, and East Overview 3 was probably the assistant.
So who was East Overview 1? Do you
One.
know who they were?
I don't 100%, but I'm guessing it might be the inspector.
So again, you can't see these people, but somebody's helping
Yes.
organise the dog units.
Yes.
And they seem to have located 2 possible dog units.
Yes.
And but again, you can't tell from the information on your screen where those dog units are.
No.
You can't tell how long they would take to get to Hayfield Road.
No, but I certainly seem to recall, I was pretty sure it was Edinburgh they were coming from.
Right. How did you know that?
Because I'm pretty sure that's all we had for a long time was either 1, 2, quite frankly, was an exception. So that was covering the whole of the east area. And probably 95% of the time they were Edinburgh, and they would have to go to Stirling or St Andrews or wherever.
But this was in early on a Sunday morning.
Yeah.
I'm conscious of the time.
Yes. Would that be a convenient point to stop? Mr. Masterton, can you come back tomorrow?
Yes, sir.
Well, we'll sit again at 10 o'clock tomorrow.